Hello, my name is Margaret Medor, and I'm a social worker here at the Children's Center Thunder Bay on the Preschool Assessment and Consultation Program. At this program, one of our main roles is to go into childcare programs and provide support for individual children, or also make some recommendations at the program level to make changes in the environment that benefit all children and educators. And the third part of our role is also to provide some professional development opportunities on certain topics. Um, that have been requested by educators. So just know that this presentation is sort of a short, roughly half an hour presentation, and we also provide longer, um, usually around 2-hour presentations, but also we can tailor any kind of information to fit your needs if you make a referral to our program. And also know that sometimes we offer these longer presentations as open groups that educators can sign up for. So always keep your eyes peeled for any of those upcoming events. Today, I'm going to be talking about the heart and science of feedback, which can also be described as having difficult or courageous conversations in the context of childcare that may be with other professionals, coworkers, and a lot of what we're going to focus on in terms of examples is going to be talking to caregivers and parents. And just know that for the remainder of the presentation, I will be turning off my video, and that is partly just so that I don't block any content of the slides or any of the images or anything like that. So I'll pop on the end to say goodbye. So before I begin the content of the presentation, I would just like to acknowledge that here at Children's Center Thunder Bay, we are in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory of 1850, and the land on which we work is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. We also recognize and honor the contributions made to our community by the Métis people and the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land. Our agenda for today is going to be exploring a little bit closer what is feedback and talking about giving and getting feedback. The second thing we'll look into is feedback that goes well and then maybe not so well. And then we'll look at 5 steps more thoroughly about how to provide meaningful feedback. And at the end, we'll look at a few tips just to provide effective communication in general. So what is feedback? So the definition is providing clear information to someone in a respectful manner. Feedback may be shared with parents or caregivers, service providers, or other professionals in the childcare world. And also remember that feedback may also be given to educators, supervisors, and an organization. So not only are we in a position to share information with parents and professionals, but we also need to make sure that we're asking for feedback for us as well so that we can learn and grow and make changes to our approach. In an ideal world, feedback shares information clearly, it gathers new information, it's intentional, it produces new ideas, and it leaves room for differences at the same time. So knowing that people's truths are going to be different, people's perspectives are going to be different, but as long as we can share that information, maybe we can come together and find a middle ground or come up with a new way of moving forward. So hopefully it unites people together towards a common goal. If we think about, maybe meeting with a medical professional, we want them to give us information clear. Clear is kind, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And we just want to make sure that we're thinking the same way when we provide information. So we don't want our professional doctor to be talking totally medical jargon so that we don't understand, but we also don't want them to oversimplify so that we don't know about, possible complications or what does this procedure really involve. So really thinking of that same lens, how would I want to hear information and how do I make it clear, concise, simple? So at the end of the day, people feel understood and hopeful moving forward. So I don't know if anyone has ever looked up any Pinterest or craft ideas that they want to do, or maybe recipes. So here's an example of some really tasty looking pancakes, beautiful rainbow colors. So this is what we're aiming for. This is our ideal world of communication. And then unfortunately, in the real world, sometimes our final product does not come out looking like we intended, despite our best intentions, despite all the work that we put into it and the planning that we did. It just didn't come out the way we thought. So instead, unfortunately, feedback can feel like an attack on you, the child, the center. It can make people become defensive because it activates that fight, flight, freeze response. People go into stress mode. And often it ends up feeling like blame and judgment and very personal, even if we're trying to be objective. And this can result in activating rigid thinking and stopping the progress that we're trying to move forward with this communication. So, unfortunately, at the end of the day, people end up feeling alone and misunderstood instead of understood and hopeful as we would like. So it's good to kind of remember that the best intentions don't always equal the outcome that we would like or intend. So a lot of variables will affect how feedback will be received. So we got to think about the characteristics of people giving and receiving the feedback. So if you think about providing feedback to a parent at the center, their whole life of receiving feedback from other people is going to come into play as soon as there's an important conversation to have. Also, just their personalities, how they interpret things, how they view the world, and then also the characteristics of yourself giving the information. So, you know, what did my face look like? What's my tone when I'm giving information? Is my personality to be really thorough, or is it just to kind of go fly and give out information without thinking about it too much? So, all those things are going to come into play in that interaction. Also be thinking about the topic of feedback. It's usually easier to talk about something somewhat positive that we know parents like to hear. And sometimes, even if we're bringing up something that we think is sort of mildly neutral, for them, they might feel like, oh, they're thinking we're seeing it negatively. So that might change how they interpret the information. And even things like the time of day, where we're having the conversation, everything that's happened to that person up until the time of discussion will impact their ability to hear what we're saying, interpret it, and see things the way that we're intending. So it's really it's a lot of factors to really think about. And then you have to factor in also everyone has their own life stressors that they're going through, and that's the person giving and the person receiving feedback. But know that if someone's having a really hard time, things are not going great at home, they're probably going to have an even harder time hearing a little bit more difficult information because their coping is lower. Another reason that feedback can just be so difficult in general is that parents and educators often have a lot of different things going through their minds when they're having these conversations. So, educators might be feeling even just a little bit nervous to bring up the topic because they're not sure about their confidence in their own abilities. They might be feeling like, I'm not an expert in this. Why do I need to be the one to bring it up? Or I think I'm seeing this, but I'm really not sure. So it can be difficult to move a conversation forward if you're not feeling confident about it. Also, it's important to think that how have other conversations gone when I've brought things up with parents in the past? A lot of times, educators are seeing what's going on right now and just wanting to communicate that with parents. However, parents are often seeing any issue that's brought up as a possible forever issue with their child. And they're sort of in the position of, your child is the best thing that you've ever done in your whole life, and everything about them is so important and valuable. So, any kind of threat to what you want for them or how you saw their future can feel really emotionally activating and often a little bit scary. So sometimes that might be why it's hard for parents to hear. And knowing that, educators feel like, oof, it's going to be really hard to have this conversation because they might think way into the future about this, whereas we want to focus on what's happening right now. There could be fear for both the educator or the parent. Often educators might fear that the child might leave. Parents might get angry or blame them for what's going on. So when you kind of look at the overall themes here, it's sort of like there's a struggle between providing accurate, realistic information, yet being sensitive and avoiding saying things that will be painful for parents to hear. So we call this that struggle between realism and hope. Educators want to be real and talk about what's going on, and parents have all these hopes and expectations for their little ones, and they can hear anything as a lifelong projection or destiny rather than something that's happening at a moment in time. So it can be really uncomfortable for a lot of these reasons. So when something's coming up in your childcare center and you need to talk about it with a, I'm going to say caregiver, but also know that this might be something you need to talk about even with a coworker, with a supervisor, or a supervisor with a staff member or any other professional involved in this child's life. You want to think first before you even get started about your professional stance. So be mindful about separating the personal from the professional, and this applies to parents and coworkers. It's possible to be friendly with staff without having a friendship that interferes with these important conversations. And the same thing with parents. You know, you can be friendly when you talk to them and engage with them, but it's different if you regularly text with them outside of work hours or have them on Facebook or those kinds of things. And this can be really hard in a small community. And sometimes it will happen. So it just means how do I still maintain that professional um, air while still maintaining possibly a friendship? Thinking about confidentiality. So when you're talking with caregivers, are you talking specifically about their child, or do you mention other children, or can they hear you talking about things when they come in and out of the center that maybe aren't mindful of confidentiality? And also, unfortunately, in this day and age, we do have to be a little bit cautious about social media because, as much as we would like to think that our accounts are private and it's personal and I can put anything on there, which is true, also be mindful that sometimes people can come across things and we had no idea that they would be able to see them. So just be mindful of what you're putting on and the professional stance that it conveys. Everyone who works anywhere is sort of always a representative of where they work. And also just think about what I want a parent or my boss to see what I've posted because there's a possibility that they could. So always just be thinking about those things. And also think about how do I conduct myself? How do I present myself in the center? What does my body language convey about me? How much am I sharing my own personal opinions and what are they? Can people hear me swearing? Am I sharing a lot in the center? Can people overhear these things? So, all just things to think about because we really want parents to respect what we're saying and see us as a trusted source. Another thing to think about before we have a conversation is how good of a foundation have we built with that family? So we need to invest in relationships with caregivers so that we have all these positive experiences together that hold us through challenging times. So I try to recommend thinking about this from the moment the child starts in the program. But even if you found, oh, you know what, I haven't been doing this, you can start anytime. Ideally, well in advance of any kind of issues coming up, just so that your relationship is solid and that they see you as genuine. So, always good to think about sharing good things about a child every day and be genuine. And the more it shows how interested you are in their child and invested and engaged with them, it can be really helpful. So if a parent comes in to pick up and you say, oh, hi, Mr. Smith, I had a really great time playing blocks with Molly today. We were really engaged together and it was really nice to connect with her in that way. Try to make it as personal as you can. Also, when you're giving just comments to caregivers, try to avoid saying anything about good or bad days overall because it's very general and it's really helpful if you can provide a little bit more detail about what happened instead. Try to be curious when you're talking to caregivers. You never know what else might be going on in their lives or related to this issue. So, always kind of asking open ended questions or trying to find out about their lives in a non invasive way can be helpful. And also try to stay positive and assume the best. I know a lot of times our mind jumps to some negative things and our thought bubbles can kind of run away with us. So try to reflect on that and be mindful of what's going through my mind. What am I thinking about? And I think in this day and age, it can be really hard to find times to communicate because COVID has impacted the way that we see and deal with parents. So, any way that we can find to do that, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an app that allows us to share some things about the child, or even just a little daily communication update on paper, anything like that, try to get creative and still find a way to maintain those relationships with caregivers. The other thing I like to think of in this sort of stage of things is that the more we're keeping up contact and letting caregivers know throughout the process of childcare, it prevents a buildup of negative things from happening, where then we can sort of unload all these things happened, but they haven't heard any of them. So try to give that balanced communication the whole way through. It could be, this was one of the best things that happened today, and this was an area where we're working on today, or it was a little bit of a struggle for us, and share those things along the way. If we're proactive, it becomes less of a big, icky issue later on. And be patient. It takes time. It's sort of like planting seeds and watering them and caring for them so that they grow and develop. So, when an issue comes up that we need to communicate to somebody, again, just going to go with the caregiver, but again, remember that it could be any other kind of staff or professional. So, check in and empathize and try to get yourself in that person's shoes. So, ask yourself, what would it feel like to get this information right now? Based on my relationship and past discussions with this person, what might they be thinking? What's going well for the child or the caregiver? What else might be happening for this child or caregiver? What else is going on in their world? Other life stressors that they might be facing that might be impacting this issue. And then also thinking about, how am I feeling about this? Because you really want to know where you're at before you have the conversation. So it's helpful to consider all these questions and think about them as much as you can, but try not to let it raise so much anxiety or become so overwhelming that it defers the conversation from happening. Step two, search for support. So discuss your concerns with a supervisor or maybe even coworkers where appropriate. Think about what you need to feel calm and supported. Is it a little bit of a prep meeting beforehand? Does it need to be more than one of you in the conversation? Is it you and your floor mate? Is it with the supervisor? Do we need to have a team meeting after to debrief? What's going to help you have this conversation the way you want to? And also think about what the caregiver needs to feel calm and supported. So you got to think a little bit about the magnitude of the issue. If it's something that, oh my gosh, you know what, we're going to be talking about this probably for months. It's a big deal. Do we start in small bites? Should we have a separate meeting? Do we want both parents or caregivers? Or if there's only one, do they need another support person to be part of this conversation? So just try and think about what they would want and maybe even ask them, I have something to talk about and it might be a bit of a difficult conversation. Is there someone that you want to be present, or should we do this with you and so and so? And you can feel them out and hopefully they'll have a sense of what they need to. Step three is sort of all the preparation work that goes into the conversation. So, first, think about your state of mind. Will I be able to take a negative reaction and make it not personal and avoid getting defensive? Because I think, as we talked about, even when we have the best of intentions, even when we've really planned out what we're going to say and we've tried to be mindful and empathetic and cautious, a lot of times the content in and of itself will be taken personally and sometimes negatively despite those intentions. So you want to be in a position where you know that and you can say, okay, even if they say this to me or they go in this direction or this happens, I'll know that it's not about me and I'm not going to go into my own fight, flight, freeze and get defensive and maybe say other things. I'm going to be able to say, I know this is really hard and we'll keep working on this together. So, really checking in with your own state of mind and ability to get through those reactions. Also, reflect on your own previous experience. What was it like to have feedback? What did I find was helpful when people did? What did I find did not help or really negatively impacted? And also think about the right time and the right place. Like I talked about before, time of day. If it's in the middle of the childcare with loud noises, it's not going to be as well received. Know the facts, keep them brief, try to have a really clear, concise topic, and try not to get lost in too many details. Sometimes it helps to write it out or say it out and practice as much as you possibly can. And step 4 is committing to just do it and always remember that the most important part of communication is not what you say, but the way in which you say it and the attitude you adopt when you deliver it. I always think too that when I come to have a discussion with someone, sometimes it's helpful to sort of do an introductory blurb about what you're going to say. And that gives you a chance to empathize with the parent. You know, I know what I'm about to bring up might be really hard to hear, and I'm really hoping I won't upset you as we work on this together. And also, it can be helpful at this time too to acknowledge that a lot of children have difficulties in the childcare setting that they don't have in the home environment, just due to the nature of the environments being so different. There's so many more social pressure, there's a lot of stresses, there's sensory overload, there's different routines that have a little bit less flexibility. So there's a lot going on for little children in these environments, and it's important to remember that and maybe even remind parents of that before you even have this discussion, because it might feel a little bit less personal as a result. And it's sort of like, okay, a lot of these things are expected to happen. And it is really about us just putting our heads together and figuring it out. So, one thing that can make giving feedback sort of simple and straightforward and kind of follows those first few steps that we talked about is called the SET approach. So that's an acronym for support. First, make a statement of support, acknowledge the struggles, the experience, and open that door for communication. And then empathize with the family. So connect to the feelings of the event, the experience of struggling through this issue. And then you want to introduce what the topic is that is needed to talk about. So this will make more sense with this example, specifically for an ECE program. So the statement of support might be, we really enjoy having Johnny in the program, empathizing. I'm guessing you're really frustrated because every time you pick up Johnny, we have something negative to say. Truth. The truth is, we are really struggling to understand how to manage his behaviors, and we think that the involvement of an RC would help. So there it is. It's simple, it's easy, it's clear, it gets straight to the point. It says everything it needs to say, and it's also being mindful of the parent's experience of what's going on right now. Then step 5 might be reflecting or possibly repairing, depending on how things went. So if you can, ask the other person for feedback on that conversation and ask yourself also key questions about the process. So how did I introduce it? What was my response maybe when they responded back? And be honest about it. Was it the way I intended? Maybe did I get defensive? Did I go off in a different direction? Did I deflect? Did I minimize? Any of those things. And how did you conclude the feedback? You might need to think about closing the loop. So what are the next steps to using this information? Maybe follow up with what you agreed to do. Tomorrow is a new opportunity, so you always want to make sure, okay, what we talked about yesterday, everything's complete, and maybe it's going to be another discussion, or maybe it is following up on something that you agreed to do. Also, just look at the big overall experience. What went well? What would you do differently? Think about all those things. So, the next thing I'm going to briefly touch on is just sort of some basics of effective communication. So we're going to talk a little bit about packaging of information, and this includes avoiding sugarcoating or glossing over things. So it's sort of maintaining that maybe you'll bring up an issue, but you'll also sugarcoat it and make it seem like it's actually fine. Um, you may have also had some experience with the sandwich. So saying something positive and then talking about the real issue and then following it up with something positive, which actually just leads to a lot of confusion about the issue, or it just totally gets erased because, oh, but everything's good because that's all I heard at the beginning and the end. We're going to talk in a minute a little bit more about the but statements. And then also remembering to look back at that set approach because it is just like a really simple way to communicate information. And remembering that overall, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And that's one of our favorite quotes from Brene Brown. So we've borrowed that from her just as a reminder. Because sometimes I think if we think the information we're providing is unkind, we want to make it a little less clear. We want to sugarcoat it. We want to sandwich it. We want to do all of those things because it feels like a hard thing to talk about. But at the end of the day, the more clear and effective the communication is, the better it will be in the end for the person receiving it. So let's think about packaging here. So if I received this gift, I would think, okay, like maybe someone threw this together at the last minute. I'm not sure that I really want the gift. It's probably re-gifted. It might not have anything to do with me. I'm not really trusting the contents of this particular package. On the other hand, if I receive this package, I'm a little bit on edge because it's so ornate, it's so overdone, it's so sugar-coated. I'm a little bit like, wow, can what's in here actually be as good as the wrapping? I don't know what's going on here. Again, I'm also feeling a little untrusting of the content. Whereas if you present things clearly and transparently here, it's a simply wrapped box with the lid open and it's clear. It's transparent. I know what's going on. The inside matches the outside, and I'm more comfortable with the information. So this is what we're aiming for. Simply wrapped, open box. The other thing to think about, and I think that we all do this, and ever since we've been talking about this in the context of this presentation at work, I've noticed how often I do it. So everything is really great, but we use the word but a lot. And unfortunately, what it does is it erases, as you see here, there's this little eraser, it erases everything that came before it. So if you think about it, you could make a statement that's empathizing or acknowledging, and then you say the word but, and it almost erases or dismisses those feelings. It asks people to put those feelings aside because what you think is more important. So, for an example, even just saying something like, I understand you're mad at me, but I'd like to apologize. It's sort of like, I don't care that you're mad at me. I'd like to apologize. Whereas if you say, and, so even listen, I understand that you're mad at me and I'd really like to apologize. So it's adding to, it's acknowledging that feeling and it's adding to it. It's not taking away from it. So here's another example. You might be worried about your child not being ready to move up to the toddler room, but we will do our best to support this difficult transition. So I don't care that you're worried. We're doing what we need to do. So it's all good. Whereas if you said, you might be worried about your child not being ready to move up to the toddler room, and we will do our best to support this difficult transition. It's adding, it's not taking away, it's saying what you're feeling is valid, and this is what we're going to do about it. So I'm personally working really hard to catch those buts and switch it to and. So practice that a little bit, try it in your life, and see how it makes a difference for people that you're talking to. Or think about it, if you hear it from someone else, wouldn't that have felt better if it was an and? So try it. So 10 quick rules to effective communication that are just good things to consider when you're having a conversation with someone. Try to be as present as you can. Don't multitask. Also, try not to think that you have all the answers or you even really know the issue, Assume you have something to learn, assume other people have something to contribute or share to the conversation. Try to use open ended questions as much as you can to find out more information and not insert our own thoughts into the questions. Also, try your best to go where the conversation goes and stay present. This can be really difficult, especially if we're a little bit anxious about the topic, because we might want to be overly prepared and have it go the direction that we're comfortable with and make sure that our agenda gets across. And sometimes we have to actually let that go a little bit and try to stay where that person is going. It might mean we have to have another conversation at another time to get back to some of the things we didn't cover, but in the end, it'll ultimately make them feel more heard and more part of the process. Also, if you don't know, say so. It's fine to be honest that, oh, you know what, I might need to look into that a little bit more, or I might need to check on that. People usually appreciate that over pretending to know something that's wrong. Also, try not to equate your experience with theirs. It's not the same. Sometimes we try to relate to people and share experiences, and sometimes that can be alienating for people and it sort of backfires. So try to just really focus on what they're going through and don't talk about your own experiences as much as possible, unless they ask. Try not to repeat yourself. Try to stay out of the weeds. So, that kind of detail overload, clear and concise, what needs to be said. It doesn't need to be a whole detailed description of an incident that happened. You can get to the gist of it and stay concise. Try to listen as best as you can and be an active participant in listening. And again, try to be brief. That kind of sums up some of the other things we talked about. So, also important to consider when feedback is not going well, because caregivers may be overwhelmed, unaware, underaware, preoccupied, in denial, and you may see a variety of responses as a result. So, they might be silent and withdrawn. We kind of talked about going into their own fight, flight, or freeze. So, you might see fight looking like lashing out in anger, blaming the childcare center, turning things around against you, those kinds of things. But you might also see flight, so making up excuses to end the conversation and get away. You know what? I have a really important work meeting. I can't talk about this right now. Finding a reason to leave. And you also might see that kind of freeze and shut down response. So they might be silent and withdrawn. Other things you might see talking excessively, saying yes, but, and sort of coming up with, I don't want to call it excuses, but other reasons that might contribute or explain this and not staying with the issue, blaming others. Often parents might actually cry, and this could be a moment of vulnerability, and that might actually give you a chance to connect and really support that parent. Um, but it also could feel really uncomfortable and be difficult to continue the conversation or difficult to know where to go with that. So I would always think that trying to support them, connect with them over this, and also that's a reminder of how difficult these things can be for parents and how can we join together. They might refuse to interact with you, pull their child from the center, or they might completely deny any issue. And all those things can be really, really difficult. And it might just mean that the conversation has to be put on hold and come up with a few other solutions with your team, maybe get creative about brainstorming. And when here, I have another slide here that just kind of offers some suggestions when you're met with some of these things that you can do. So you can always take a breath and ask for a pause. So you can acknowledge, hey, this is new information for me. Thank you for sharing it. I'd really like to give that some more thought. I think it might help for us to come back to this later. And it might be you need to talk about what they've brought up or deal with the feelings that are in the room. And you could say something like, I know this is a lot of information. Would you like some time to process it? That might be something good to say if you're seeing a little bit of a shutdown or you're not quite sure how they're interpreting or they don't have a lot to say. It might be, okay, let's give you some time with this information. And if you're seeing them becoming upset, it could be whether they're crying or getting angry. I'm sorry that this information is so upsetting. We both want your child to do well, and I hope that we can work together on this. When things get a little bit more escalated, try your best to stay calm. Do whatever strategies you've got. whether it's sort of a deep breath or it's wiggling your toes or it's maybe like flexing your hands a little bit, something that grounds you. And try to remember that it's usually not personal. It is about how they're feeling about the information. Try to roll with their resistance. It doesn't sound like you have the same worries. And maybe try to talk about what you guys do have in common, or try to find out, is there something that you're seeing more than we're seeing? So be curious, try to find out more, support their decision making process. You're the parent, and ultimately it's your decision. And sometimes I also think about how helpful it can be to revisit that conversation about the differences in the home and childcare environment, just because sometimes parents do really start to take it personally or they get confused because they haven't seen the issues that you're talking about. So it can be really helpful to revisit. A lot of children experience things differently at childcare than they do at home. And there's a lot of different behaviors that we see, and it isn't necessarily a negative thing. It just means we have to figure out and meet their needs a little bit better. So try to find ways to frame things like that. And if for some reason someone's getting escalated to a point that it's no longer appropriate, you set your limits when needed. So I see that you're very upset, and swearing at me is not going to help. I think we should revisit this later. So you can find ways like that to frame things so that you're acknowledging what's going on and you're also being true to your own boundaries for your own comfort and safety. So that wraps up the end of our presentation. And in conclusion, people may forget what you said, people may forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So just try to remember that in all these conversations, we are trying to understand that it's difficult for any caregiver to have a child who's struggling, and we want to be mindful of that and connect with them and support them. And really, we're working on trying to join together and sharing information that can help them have their child achieve the very best. So finding whatever ways we can to convey that, and hopefully, these steps will give you a little bit of a framework to think that through, talk it through, and really rely on the team that's around you to help you with it as well. And practice, practice, practice as much as you can. Okay, thank you so much for listening.